So I think that not only the result in Makerfield, but the magnitude of the result in Makerfield really changed, I think, the dynamics inside the Parliamentary Labour Party and the Labour Party and the country in general. No one other than Andy could have turned that around so close to what was such a absolutely gargantuan defeat for us in the local elections in the same area like 6 weeks earlier. And I think that told its own story, that people want to vote Labour, they want a reason to vote Labour, and in Andy they found that reason.
Well, look, let's now still keep on the topic of politics. Andy Burnham yesterday very much sailed through the threshold of MPs nominating him. He is very much on course to become the next leader of the Labour Party. That will actually happen a week today, and then he's expected to become Prime Minister the following Monday. And of course, this all happened because after the very bad set of local elections and bad elections in Scotland and Wales, a number of ministers and cabinet ministers said enough is enough. Keir Starmer, you've got to go. And that then sort of set off this kind of catalyst of events which resulted in the Makerfield by-election. And I do feel that British politics is so driven by by-elections now. And of course we had the Makerfield by-election. We've now got this Clacton by-election coming up as well. Well, another one of those ministers who resigned was someone called Zubir Ahmed. He's the Labour MP for Glasgow South West. He's also a doctor. He still practices. He's a transplant surgeon. He was actually inspired to become a member of Parliament during the COVID pandemic. And he was a junior health minister in the Department of Health. He was a parliamentary he was a junior minister under Wes Streeting. And he called for Keir Starmer to resign. And he joins us now. Zubir, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
No, hi, Ayesha. Thanks for having me.
So look, now, yesterday there was this stampede of MPs going to nominate Andy Burnham. Many people who said, "Oh, by the way, I want to back Keir Starmer." Were you one of those people who nominated Andy Burnham?
I was, yeah. I got my nomination in, and despite my doctor's handwriting, I think it was legible enough to people to realise it was Andy I was nominating. Yeah. And
was that even though you had backed you'd backed Wes Streeting to be leader? Why did you then go and nominate Andy?
So I think that not only the result in Makerfield, but the magnitude of the result in Makerfield really changed, I think, the dynamics inside the Parliamentary Labour Party and the Labour Party and the country in general. No one other than Andy could have turned that around so close to what was such a absolutely gargantuan defeat for us in the local elections in the same area like 6 weeks earlier. And I think that told its own story, that people want to vote Labour, they want a reason to vote Labour, and in Andy they found that reason. And I think the story that he was telling not only to Makerfield but to the rest of the country, because by the way, I know you know the west of Scotland well, areas in my constituency like Pollock and Govan are not dissimilar to some of the areas that I canvassed in Makerfield. And I just felt the message that he carried, the way the voters responded to it, meant that he was best placed to probably take it forward to the country as well. And actually, when you started to interrogate some of the stuff he was saying around the economy, on immigration, on the kind of growth that he wants to see in the country, Wes and Andy were not a million miles apart. And so actually Wes also took the decision that he would back Andy. And
is also, like, just being very honest about it, is a lot of the stampede also from people that might want, yourself included, want either a job or their old job back from Andy Burnham?
Look, I think Andy's got enough to contend with over the next 10 days or so, less than 10 days now, I think, before hopefully he gets into number 10. People will have, like in any job, which with their own motivations for doing what they do. But ultimately, I genuinely believe most people that have nominated him realise, because the mood of the country is to move on swiftly from an era of Labour government that I think has been relatively successful, but not, I think, impactful enough, into one where I think we need a Prime Minister that the public can feel closer to than the one they have had before. And that is the reason why most people in the PLP nominated him, because they realise people are coalescing around him in the country, as well as in the PLP, and we need a swift changeover. And I think that's the main reason, through the responsibility they've been charged with by the constituents, that they did it.
Now, I mean, there's definitely, I think there's a lot of good vibes in the Labour Party right now, and the Labour Party had been absolutely moribund for a long time. Labour MPs 2 years in after the election victory, because, as you say, very, very bad results every time Labour was, going to the ballot box. But I think amongst the country, there is a sense of real despair that we are now on the brink of having our 7th Prime Minister in 10 years. Lots of my listeners, Zubir, are saying, well, hang on a minute, we actually didn't vote for this guy. We voted for Keir Starmer 2 years ago. We don't like this revolving door of prime ministers. We didn't like it under the Conservatives. We didn't expect this from Labour. And as yet, there's very little flesh on the bone in terms of what Andy Burnham is going to do. Do you recognise how a lot of people out in the public are not, they're not, I mean, I know Labour MPs are pretty happy at the moment, but actually the country is feeling pretty miserable about the state of politics at the moment, and this change isn't filling loads of people with enthusiasm?
Yeah, listen, I totally get that perspective, Ayesha. But there's also, I think, a bigger perspective, which was kind of flushed out and teased out during those local elections in England, this parliamentary election, Scottish parliamentary elections in Scotland, and the Assembly elections in Wales. And that, for me, and I think many people have come to this conclusion now, was not run-of-the-mill midterm blues. That was a proper repudiation of, unfortunately, Keir as leader of our country. And in that sense, when you've had that level of repudiation and feedback from the public, which is unprecedented, I think also members of Parliament in the governing party have a responsibility to reflect what that means and be honest with themselves and with the leader, as I did, as others did. And that's why we ended up in this situation. Is it ideal? It's far from ideal, but I think what would have been even less ideal is to somehow believe that the status quo unchecked would have delivered a different result for our party or indeed the country.
And look, David from Grimsby's messaged in with a very interesting point, saying we're, as the public, we're sick of sort of personalities. What we want is, he said, look, we need policies, we don't need personalities. Personalities are actually making this country poorer and more sort of chaotic. Now, I think everybody would sort of agree, and I think people do feel a certain amount of sympathy for Keir Starmer, but Andy Burnham seems more confident, more comfortable in his skin, a better communicator, although, let's see, he's not yet Prime Minister and there's a lot of scrutiny. A lot of people can be very good campaigners. Governing is, they say campaign in poetry and, governing prose. It is different governing. But the fundamentals don't change, Zubir. There's lots of there's still very tight public finances. We need to find a lot of money for defence spending. We've got growth is still completely sluggish. Small businesses are on their knees. How is Andy Burnham going to radically change things while sticking to the manifesto commitments?
Yeah, I mean, you say personality is not important, and you know what? Before I came into politics, I was all about facts, policy, but I think we all lie to ourselves if we don't acknowledge that the tone of leadership and how you communicate that is set from the top. And Andy, in that sense, is a very different beast from Keir, and already you can see the difference he's making to the mood of the country. In terms of policy specific, look, at the moment, they're going through a massive process right now of where they can change things up in the economy, where they can think about releasing capital, whether it's how we address the wealth gap. I think there's a big issue in the intergenerational wealth gap that we have to address with taxation policy. I know that they're working that up. They're looking at how they approach the net zero agenda as well, to make it much more equitable than it is right now. So I think there's a lot to be done, even within the confines of the fiscal rules, to make people feel like there's not just one section of society or a few at the top winning and accumulating wealth at a rate of 20-30% a year when the rest of the economy is only growing at 1.5% per year. So I think that sense of unfairness, I think that can be changed, in the Exchequer and by Number 10 within the confines of the fiscal rules. And also, this idea of devolution and more power to local places, I think is actually very, very powerful, including in Scotland, by the way, because people think, we've got a devolved parliament in Scotland, that's all you need. But you'll know that power is also now concentrated in Edinburgh and in Holyrood. It's never found its way into places like Glasgow and Glasgow South West, and the picture of Govan behind me. And I think this is an important point to set a challenge all across the country, that you can disseminate power to city regions. You can create city regions like Glasgow City Region and make them flourish like you did in Manchester. I mean, we are very envious in Glasgow what's happened in Manchester because we don't have a mayor.
But you have got a First Minister in Scotland. Is there a danger that if everything becomes about moving power away from Westminster, does that perhaps turbocharge a nationalist case for separation?
I don't think so, because I think what it does is actually make people sit up and recognise the similarities they have with one another, regardless of the invisible border of Hadrian's Wall when it comes to Scotland and England. Like, people in my constituency, like I said, have much more in common with people in Manchester and Makerfield than they perhaps would do in people in Perth and Inverness-shire and Aberdeenshire. So I think it actually allows people to think about opportunities across this border that we've kind of created in our heads, but doesn't really exist in practice. Because it suited one political agenda for the last sort of 17, 18 years. So I think I'm quite excited about that, actually. But also to your point about devolution, I do think when you're thinking about devolution of power, particularly in England into the regions, and this is something that I've thought about in the health space, you also have to define what you don't devolve and what you have to direct from the centre. Like if I think about the NHS technological transformation, we're so far behind the curve on that because for 14 years the Tories basically robbed capital budgets to just pay for day-to-day patch repairs in the NHS. I think some of that has to be driven from the centre if we're going to do it quickly and equitably in places in Northern England as well. So I think that's important as well to think about what you do need to retain.
Just read a couple of messages coming in. Keach has said, yes, there was definitely a Burnham effect, but in Makerfield, the deplorable reform candidate was also a factor. And Jamie says, Keir Starmer's legacy is dreadful, at least with Andy Burnham, and we'll not get an island of strangers speech. That's from Jamie. And Helen says, hello, Ayesha, thanks for a great show. Thank you, Helen. She said, but I and many others are concerned about the very fast pace of the replacement of Keir Starmer. What detailed scrutiny has Andy Burnham had? We do not want another Mandelson debacle whose appointment was also done in haste. What would you say to Helen Zubir? Because she does raise a respectable question about scrutiny.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say to Helen is, Andy was elected like all of us were, by their constituency residents. So in that sense, he's got an electoral mandate. And of course, I know it's a moot point sometimes, but we're a parliamentary democracy. So the Prime Minister is not directly elected. The Prime Minister is invited to form a government by the King on the basis of the fact that he or she has confidence of a core number of parliamentarians, in which case which Andy does, and also to reassure Helen and other listeners, Andy has said quite clearly that he will operate within the framework of the Labour Manifesto of 2024, on which we were elected. So in that sense, the big decisions that the economic decisions will be framed in that manifesto. So I think there is a mandate there, therefore.
Okay. Now, look, before I let you go, you were a health minister. You are still very much a busy practising transplant surgeon. There's big, obviously, health is devolved in Scotland, but you keep a keen eye in terms of what's happening with health policy across England as well. More industrial action on the horizon. It looks like things are going to be pretty tricky. What are your thoughts on that, Zubir?
Yeah, listen, the first thing to say is I think I get a little bit frustrated when people say health has devolved, because so much of health is still for nation. Certainly in my brief when I was doing life sciences, I was up in Scotland as much as it was in the north of England at times. And we have also a lot to learn from each other if we actually have a spirit of cooperation. But on your point about industrial action, I think you're probably pointing to the consultants saying that they've indicated in their ballot that they want to have industrial action. Listen, I'm a consultant too. All I would say to my consultant colleagues in England is it's hard to get a hearing when you're on an average of 150 grand a year talking about industrial action. I think you're much better placed to come and have a professional conversation with ministers, with the Secretary of State, with the department about how we move forward. For instance, like the nature and the general framework of the consultant contract, in fact, all over the country in the UK and on all four regions and nations, has not actually changed for about 25 years since we were last coming into government. And I think this is a real opportunity for consultants to sit down and really be creative as to what kind of style of working they want to do, whether they want to have a professional relationship rather than a transactional relationship, because I do think consultants are actually best placed to be leaders in the NHS, but that does need a different kind of conversation rather than the transactional one that we're having right now. So
you're sending a strong message saying, look, you're already on pretty good money, please don't do this, sit down and talk.
I think my consultant colleagues are very good at doing the medicine. They're sometimes less good at doing the politics, and I would just say to them, it's not a good look in front of the public to be talking about industrial action and strikes. when you're on those salary bands, as deserved as they are. Don't get me wrong. I think it's much better to have a conversation around how we restructure the contract, how we get the NHS out of the hole that it's been in and been put in over the last 14 years when it comes to elective waiting lists and doing things differently and different remuneration structures. I think there's a lot of scope to change the contract to the mutual benefit of the country and consultants.
OK, well, it's been really good to chat to you. Thanks very much for your time. That is the Labour MP for Glasgow South West, Zubir Ahmed. He's also a practising transplant surgeon and he was a junior health minister to Wes Streeting. Lots of messages. David